Okay, so welcome everyone. It's, well, depending on where you are, 5:02, 8:02, I'm on East Coast time. Welcome to Mangalam Research Center's Spotlight Speaker Series. I'm Karin Meyers, I'm director of Mangalam Research Center, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming my colleague Andy Rotman this evening. Andy is professor of religion, Buddhism, and South Asian studies at Smith College, and he's been engaging in textual and ethnographic work on religious and social life in South Asia for more than 25 years. His publications include Divine Stories, the Divya Avadana, Parts 1 and 2, and Thus I Have Heard, Visual. Have I been muted this whole time? Tilak?
Just part of it.
No, just for a second, just for a second.
Oh, okay. I started the intro to Andy. Did you hear that? Okay. Okay, so yeah, I don't know what happened. I didn't touch anything. Sorry, everyone. And so Andy is author of the Divyadana, Divine Stories, volumes 1 and 2, and then also Thus I've Heard, Visualizing Faith in Early Indian Buddhism, and also author of the book we'll be talking about this evening, Hungry Ghosts. And another book on a different topic entirely, on Bollywood, Brotherhood, and the nation. So we're very pleased to have Andy with us this evening. And as I mentioned, and I hope I wasn't muted for this is part of Mangalam Research Center's Spotlight Speaker Series. And Tilak, who's going to be helping me out this evening, letting me know if I mute myself by accident, will share that with you in the chat. And those of you who are gathered here might also be interested, especially those of you who are scholars of Buddhist studies, that there's 2 other volumes that Mangalam Press has recently we've recently published Language of the Sutras, which is scholarly essays on reading the Mahayana Sutras. And so Tilak will put that link in the chat. And then we also have a forthcoming volume on the Vimalakirti, a new translation of the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra by Paul Harrison. So that's not quite on sale yet, but will be very soon. So just wanted to mention those. And then also Mangalam Research Center will be hosting a National Endowment of the Humanities Summer Institute this summer, June 12th to June 24th. And applications are now open for that. And that's on Buddhism in the Imagination. It's called the Imagination and Imaginal Worlds in the Mirror of Buddhism. Hence our focus this year on the imagination in Buddhist thought, art, and practice. And that's what brings us to Andy and the Hungry Ghosts. So welcome, Andy. So pleased to have you here with us this evening.
Thank you so much.
And you will be spotlighted in a moment. There we go. So maybe I'll ask you just a general question. And so I'll let the audience know. So this will be conducted more like an interview than a formal presentation. And then I'll be asking some questions for a while, and then we'll open it up for those of you in the audience to ask questions. There'll be plenty of time for that. And so, Andy, I thought maybe just start with the general question of what inspired you to write about Hungry Ghosts, and maybe in particular how it related to your previous work, especially Thus I Have Seen and the Divine Stories.
Well, first, thank you so much and for welcoming me and letting me have this conversation. I'm thrilled. I love talking about this material. Sometimes when I finish book projects, I feel like I'm over and done with them. But this one still, I'm engaged. There's still so much to learn and so much to share. So why Hungry Ghosts? Well, here's a start. When we think about the various realms of existence, the various gatis, there are many divine realms and many hell realms. And there are many reasons that we read, or many activities that you can do such that you would be reborn in one of the divine realms or in one of the hell realms. And yet when I was reading this and other materials about the Hungry Ghost realm, what caused someone to be reborn in the Hungry Ghost realm was very specific. And in these stories, some of the earliest stories we have, the stories that I translate for this volume, and then I write my elaborate introduction and look at images, but the stories themselves come from the Avadana Shataka, the 100 stories, which were written in the early centuries of the Common Era, 3rd, 4th, 5th century. They're early, connected with the Mula Sarvastivada community. And in that collection, the stories are very, very specific, that what causes one to be reborn in the realm of Hungry Ghost is the cultivation of what the texts call mātsarya, and which I translate as a kind of double meanness. It starts off as the meanness that is stinginess, miserliness, clinging, and that leads to a kind of self-righteousness, something that isn't actually righteous, but that you believe is righteous. And that causes people to act out in spiteful, vindictive, and vicious ways. And so what I found so fascinating about this is that there was such a specific pathology of action, and that it led from a mental state to a form of action against others, that it led also to a kind of delusion. And of course, then it led to very particular rebirth types. And then one other thing that I found so interesting about this is that there were almost no representations of hungry ghosts in pre-modern South Asia, except for one little glimmer of one in Ajanta. And then there's just a profusion of images of hungry ghosts, particularly in the Tibetan community and kind of across East Asia. So it was interesting that there was this disjunction between text and image, where textual histories and image histories just didn't match up that well. So it allowed for kind of multiple histories of thinking about the world of hungry ghosts in the imagination and practices of others. Now, the other question you asked was how this connects to my previous work. So previously, I spent a lot of time translating these kind of avadanas, a large part of the Divya Avadana collection that preserves many of the stories that were culled from the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, with some additional ones. And so I'd gotten really into kind of the language and logic of these monastic stories. And the Hungry Ghost collection here from the Avadana Shataka shares that same world. So it's a world that I know well. And I felt like I really needed to get the world well to translate well. One of the things that the text is very clear about is that seeing hungry ghosts and reading them about is supposed to trigger both disgust and samvega, that you're meant to be moved. And to try to translate in just the right way to conjure the correct form of disgust and hopefully create the right form of aesthetic response that is samvega was hard. And I wouldn't have tried it if I hadn't already translated a whole big bunch, because I probably just would have produced a poor translation.
Yeah, well, it's a question coming up about all these scatological metaphors. You have some nice translations of those, how they render into idioms even familiar to us in English. But one of the questions that just came up as you were introducing this now, and that pertains to this theme of this NEH, as well as there's some students here I know from this course on Buddhism in the Imagination that I'm teaching right now, is what role, so you mentioned, there's all these, visual images that get produced relatively late, but we have these very evocative images in the narratives themselves. And I wonder if you wanted to say a few words about the work of narrative on the imagination, and yeah, sort of what these texts, a little more about what these texts are doing for their hearers.
Yeah, so that's a great question. You know, when you come across the descriptions of hungry ghosts here, it's actually, I'm going to read a brief description of one of the hungry ghosts here, and then I'm going to talk about kind of my own sensibility here. And this is from a story called A Pot of Shit, and it's Mogglayana, the Venerable Mogglayana, now coming up to the Buddha and explain what he's just seen. And here he goes. He says, Bhadanta, Mogglayana said, I'm coming from a journey through the realm of hungry ghosts. There I saw a hungry ghost who looked like a burned out tree stump, naked and totally covered with hair, with a mouth like the eye of a needle and a stomach like a mountain. She was ablaze, alight, aflame, a single fiery mass, racked with sensations that were searing, piercing, distressing, agonizing, and acute. She was crying out in pain. Just by her sight, rivers and wells would dry up, and when the heavens sent rain, on her would fall a shower of sparks and embers. She was foul smelling, really foul smelling. She looked like shit, literally, and she was feeding on feces, and even those she only procured with difficulty. So part of what I find interesting about this description is that it's very difficult to put all the pieces together. I mean, if you were actually going to draw this, right, someone, a burned out stump, and also covered with hair, and also like kind of fully inflamed, and with a tiny mouth and a giant stomach, it's almost like a kind of like an oxymoron. Like you have a difficult time putting all the pieces together. And I think that was part of it, a way of creating a kind of horror and disgust, something kind of unimaginable. And in this world too, still dominated in many ways by Brahmanical purity rules, the idea that you would literally kind of be eating shit, right? So one of the kind of the curses of hungry ghosts is that they're perpetually hungry and thirsty, and in this text, and any food and drink that they are offered kind of turns to urine and excrement. And in this case, the person actually looks like shit. We'll find kind of shit is everywhere here. And it's meant to be disgusting. So this is also one of the oddities of you're trying to produce a book that will appeal to people, and key to the book is that people will find the stories disgusting. So that's also a tricky thing to navigate. But textually, it's supposed to invoke a kind of a horror, and they're very clear that it's supposed to invoke disgust. They use the rasa term bibhatsa. So these are folks who knew their Alankara Shastra, right? I mean, they knew their literary theory. They knew what disgust looked like, and they were trying to kind of invoke it as a way of triggering an emotional response. And it's both kind of a little bit alien and a little bit disgusting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a couple of questions coming up from that description that you just read. And I guess one has to do with exactly where are the hungry ghosts? So one footnote, you talk about that's interesting, but part of what prompts me to ask this is they seem to be operating, and maybe this is something that Sonam Kachur talks a little bit about in, maybe he talked about in the dissertation and not in the book, but it's, you know, the sort of poignancy of the hungry ghost condition depends on that they have a memory of being human. And so they're not, to me, they never seem quite as distant as beings in the hell realm, you know, like they are, you know, they're trying to live almost human lives, but they can't, because what they turn, you know, and they have this like very immediate effect on their environment, transforming it in a way that I don't know that that's the case in the hell realms. At least it's not as salient in my memory of reading descriptions there. But, you know, so like she's reaching, you know, and trying to eat it, but it's all she can procure is shit And, even that's hard. And so there's both this like very sensitivity to the environment, but an expectation about the environment, which is based on a more like, this isn't maybe the natural thing that she wants to eat, unlike, animals eat animal things, and hungry ghosts want to eat human things, but they can't. So
there's a few questions there like packed in. Let me see if I can unpack a few of them. Okay. So one of the things is about what hungry ghosts remember. One of the interesting things about the kind of the hungry ghosts that appear in most stories here, although not necessarily in some of the Pali collections, particularly the Petavatu, here all the hungry ghosts basically led before had human lives, right? So in that way, they're a bit like our notion of ghosts, right? Pretas that have continued on from the human existence. And one of their curses, really, is that they know exactly the deed that they've done to be reborn where they are. So this is usually considered kind of a great riddhi, a great magical power to be able to know previous lives. But here it's kind of bestowed on the hungry ghosts so that they know there's no one else they can blame it on. They know exactly what the deed that they have done that has led them to be reborn there, and they are suffering the consequences. So they function as kind of truth tellers throughout this, right? Everyone who comes across the hungry ghosts will speak the truth. It's a bit like kind of scared straight videos where you get kind of prisoners who tell you about the horrible things that they did and they're now experiencing and want you to not follow their path. So hungry ghosts have that kind of knowledge and they kind of speak the truth to anyone who sees them. So where are they? So hungry ghosts actually live, according to the texts, and others will find it in the Abhidhamma Kosha and otherwise, they basically live in two places. They either live kind of 500 yojanas deep in the ground in Yama's palace, or they live in our world. And most of the cases are hungry ghosts are a lot like animals. They inhabit the human realm with us, and they might live in a distinct realm, but they live among us. And we see that in images. We'll see it where kind of hungry ghosts kind of pop up all over the place. Now, what's interesting about the hungry ghosts in these stories is that they're liminal creatures, right? They're living kind of like usually just outside of town, and part of it is they're afraid of humans, as we find. When humans see them, humans are terrified of them. So they tend to be scared. And they often live in areas that are filled with urine and excrement. So we'll find them in kind of like sewage troughs and other places kind of just outside of town, living in kind of, yes, we'll call them in those kinds of places. Instead of me going on, I'll wait for another question.
Okay, yeah, several. Well, one was that sort of what, so who can see the hungry ghosts is one question.
Great question. So who can see the hungry ghosts? Everyone can see the hungry ghosts. What's fascinating in these stories is that the humans who see the hungry ghosts are either monastics or people who are basically uneducated and have not been socialized. What the texts are saying is that we're socialized not to see hungry ghosts. And when the Buddha or someone else points them out, then we get to see them. But we're just used to not seeing them. There's a corollary here. You could also think with like homeless or other folks in people's community where we're trained to not see them over a while. We're socialized into that. There's a wonderful story. It's the last one in this collection, Jambala. And he's like an outcast kid. He's never gone to school. He's another one who like will pick up shit and live in places, right? So he has no teacher, no friends, nothing. And what they say is there's a group of 500 ghosts on the outskirts of town, living in another kind of sewage trough. And he just walks up to them, sees them, talks with them, and befriends them. And it's this fascinating thing that it's the person who has the least education, the least skills, the least socialization, who can actually recognize these people and see them. And we all have the ability. So say the texts, we're just not used to using it.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that comes up with all of these pollution metaphors, that we find throughout, that they're just horribly polluted beings, and And even when they're alive, they're doing things that are really polluting sometimes in order to get them, you know, like they're feeding shit to a monk or something. So when thinking about that, I thought, well, it's really contrasted to the purity of certain states, like all these divine states, like the Brahma Viharas. And in particular, you didn't talk about this, but I was wondering if the opposite of it was really mudita, you know, because there's the, or the, you know, the empathetic joy, because that's like, you know, in enjoying others' good fortune. And here there's like not, you know, really being upset that other people are getting things.
Let me give it a slightly different kind of gloss. What the texts are saying, in some ways, they're drawing a corollary between the disgust that we might have for hungry ghost bodies, right? But what the text is saying, that basically there are two kinds of hungry ghosts. There are the hungry ghosts, we could say the physical bodies that hungry ghosts are kind of reborn into, but there's hungry ghost mindsets. And what the text is really most concerned with is the hungry ghost mindset that humans cultivate, right? So in that way, in some ways, when we're thinking really kind of good thoughts, when we're in some pure state, we, even as humans in some meditation realm, you know, in some ways we visit the gods. And as we say in English, right, other times our minds are in the gutter. But the text would really say, you know, our minds are in the hungry ghost realm. That's really what the text is focused on. And what they're trying to do in some ways with us is, right now, they're trying to get us to think of the disgust that we feel for the physical bodies of hungry ghosts and that state of eating shit and whatnot. What they're trying to get us to do is to focus that kind of disgust on humans who cultivate this form of meanness, because that's what's really disgusting. What's actually disgusting are mean humans who are stingy, miserly, cruel, and spiteful, whereas beings who are reborn in the hungry ghost realm, right? They know karma. They know exactly the deeds that they have done to be reborn there. Hungry ghosts, beings who were reborn in hungry ghost bodies don't have hungry ghost mindsets, right? So in some ways, they're actually not hungry ghosts. It depends. Are you a being because of your body or because of your mental state? So, and what's interesting about that is because these hungry ghosts in some ways have this knowledge, what the text says, they should be the objects of our compassion. They know the truth. It's just that they're born in these bodies that are veritable prison houses, right? They're torture chambers. They're born in bodies that are constantly inflamed. There's this one description that I love, hate, that appears again and again of the hungry ghost. It's not just that they're like burning and inflamed, they're perpetual cremations. What it is because of their own karma, they're constantly setting themselves on fire. Except unlike a proper cremation where someone would kind of like burn to ashes, here they're just in a constant state of burning. Literally, they're burning off their karma, and experiencing that constant burning. What the text is saying is, we're supposed to feel compassion for these folks, to not be deluded by the externals of their physical form, but to really focus on their mental states and on their care. And we find throughout these stories, and in so many, is hungry ghosts are not only truth tellers, they really want others not to follow their path. Like they're invested in other humans not doing what they've done. So that's not the same as cultivating like mudita or something, but it's a kind of cautionary tale. And also for when we do see people who might look like hungry ghosts, right? In some ways that are starving, because that's literally what hungry ghosts are, or are homeless, or are kind of covered in excrement, to approach them with compassion. And this will lead to a question, which I'm sure you'll ask me about feeding hungry ghost rituals, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so just to summarize, make sure I understand. So when we're looking at them, the actions that human beings do to get them, we're supposed to have disgust for those, but then the sort of results, I mean, yes, there's disgust for that, but there's an extreme compassion for, you know, these beings who've recognized what they've done. And it seems part of the thing that's so off-putting about the human beings when they're engaging in these actions that get them born as hungry ghosts. You talk about bad faith versus kind of good faith. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about this idea of bad faith that is particularly illustrative of their some of the meanness of the hungry ghost.
Well, I've written at other times about faith, and the kind of the cultivation of faith. And what's interesting about the hungry ghosts is that they perform actions basically to trick people. I mean, it's precisely in bad faith. So in the story that I was reading, A Pot of Shit, there is a hungry ghost who develops an illness. He needs homemade nutritious food. He goes and asks for homemade nutritious food. A householder asks his daughter-in-law or daughter, to give nutritious food to the hungry ghost every day. And she's like, when the hungry ghost shows up, she says, sure, I'll give you nutritious food, goes in, fills a bowl full of shit, covers it up with food to basically try to trick the hungry ghost. And we find this way that part of the pathology of being taken over by meanness isn't just clinging, right? What we read in accounts of Buddhaghosa and others when we think they're the Pali term mātsarya, that kind of, they're focusing there on the clinging, the stinginess, the holding on. But here we have something different, right? It starts with a kind of clinging, holding on, and then it's a lashing out. The image that I had in mind is like, a big cat, like kind of clenching back and then lunging forward. And there's the way that they act kind of spitefully using urine and excrement as their weapons. And, part of it is, it's not just that they don't have faith, they act with others in bad faith. And the question is, when they do have this kind of self-righteousness, how aware are they? This is a kind of question for Sartre and others. Like, do they actually think that they're doing the right thing? Do they not care what they're doing? Is it no faith? Is it bad faith? Is it cruelty? And it's a little bit tricky to kind of parse all these questions. But in some ways, the reason I think it's so important, or the text thinks it's so important, is what they say is that it's really easy to get caught up in meanness. And how do you know, right? How do you know if your righteousness is self-righteousness or if your righteousness is actually the Dharma? And that's an important question for the authors. So they're trying to figure out ways that one can be self-aware to not go down that path.
Yeah. And it seemed to me at one point that this distinction between bad faith and good faith is that good faith is sort of your, you might be mistaken, but you're sensitive to correction. You're willing to be corrected both about yourself and maybe about others too. Whereas the bad faith, you're just kind of wanting to reify whatever self-image, you're doing the right thing and they're wrong, but you're not maybe sensitive to correction. You're just maybe trying to reinforce a previous self-understanding. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? And, so I should say for those who haven't read the book that there's a long introduction in the first part. And, half of that introduction is me thinking kind of Buddhologically, trying to place these texts kind of historically and the ideas. And the second half is something like more comparative ethics, precisely engaging these questions of kind of good faith, bad faith, and trying to make the texts and the issues relevant to people who would actually want to engage with, to do precisely what you're doing now and ask questions about, well, what exactly might bad faith look like here? And how might that play a role in someone's personal development? So you're doing exactly what I hope people would do, even if I don't have great answers for you.
Yeah, it brings up lots of questions about, just what does meanness look like in our own society, in a kind of, neoliberal, extreme neoliberal society, in terms of justification of not giving, or justification of the other person is not deserving. And
I mean,
so,
look, one of the ways to think about this in that kind of neoliberal model is, one of the things that's being questioned here are property rights, right? Who owns what? And what obligations do we have to other humans, right? I mean, it isn't just that what the text talks about, I quite like actually in Buddhaghosa's commentary, and in some of the other commentaries too, it's the idea that when you're kind of taken over by this meanness, mātsarya, of which there are multiple kinds, it isn't just that you're holding on to something, it's the idea that if someone else had it, it's kind of unbearable, right? That if someone else would actually get one of these possessions that they somehow didn't deserve, that they somehow haven't earned, simply them getting something else for you is unbearable. Na sahati, says like kind of over and over again, which I find so interesting because that's not simply the same as clinging to your own possessions, right? I mean, that has your own particular sense of what is just in the world. And the real danger that the text says about this kind of the pathology of meanness is the self-righteousness and delusion that it leads to.
Yeah, I guess that's the jealousy piece in that of not wanting somebody to enjoy something made me think of, oh, well, that's like the flip side of mudita, where you're like very happy that there's enough in the world that everyone can have something. Right. That's wonderful. So, yeah.
But it's pretty easy to imagine people inhabiting a mind space where they see the entire world as a zero-sum game, mm-hmm. and that someone else's joy, someone else's benefit, someone else's success comes at like a cost to you, right? There's a kind of pecking order, and if someone else moves up the world, well, you've just moved down somehow. Mm-hmm. And the text is trying to kind of caution us away from that kind of thinking, and to be more giving. Yeah. Now, this is actually, let me jump in because there is one thing that's really important here, which is that there's a really close connection in this text and in many between hungry ghosts and ancestors, right? That between preta and pitra. And this is part of kind of where this originally involved in the kind of earliest Brahmanical traditions. We know that when someone would die, when someone died, they were thought to inhabit a kind of preta world for 2 weeks. And then if you perform the right rituals, this is pindadan, they would then enter the abode of ancestors. And also in a lot of Buddhist texts early on, we find this slippage between the ancestral realm and the preta realm. And what that leads to later is that when you meet a hungry ghost, it's often someone's relative, that people and a kind of fear that one's relatives are now in the hungry ghost realm. So the anxiety about others and hungry ghosts and serving hungry ghosts is really an anxiety about ancestors, mm-hmm. and where your ancestors are. And it's that crux that becomes so important in East Asia and other places, that feeding the hungry ghosts is a way of providing for your ancestors. So these are not just random people who happen to be hungry ghosts. They very well might be your mother, your grandmother, your grandfather, etc.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions also related to this piece about not wanting somebody else to enjoy. So this is going back a little bit to that previous, mm-hmm. about not wanting somebody else to have something and see, is that a lot of the characters that are portrayed in this way are women. And this made me think about, is this, so I had a couple thoughts about it. So yeah. I'll be brief with my thoughts. You can tell me what. Mm-hmm. But part of me thought, well, is this a projection? Are they speaking to men? And this is a way of like just helping the men project these qualities onto somebody else where they're bearable to see and not, directly onto themselves. That was one thought.
So let me start with that, okay. one, which is that within the text, they're pretty equal opportunity. Yeah. There are male hungry ghosts, female hungry ghosts, monk hungry ghosts, and non-hungry ghosts, right? Everybody gets to be like a hungry ghost.
Right. That's
What's
right.
more interesting, I think, about hungry ghosts is actually a kind of class position. Really rich people don't seem to become hungry ghosts, and really poor people don't seem to be hungry ghosts. The anxiety is actually about people who have some money. It's an interesting, and it's like they have enough, but not too much. And one might imagine that they don't want to kind of target the really rich because maybe the really rich are kind of donors to monasteries, whatnot. But maybe it also speaks to a real anxiety of not quite nouveau riche, but just people who have kind of like just enough. They get by, they're doing just fine, but there's some sense that they really haven't got what they deserve, and that other people like, so we might think of it as a kind of, you know, a middle class malaise, or like a middle class anger at somehow perceived injustices in the world.
Yeah, or there's a kind of precarity to their position, you know. That's especially when reading like the women who are in these positions, and you know, they've got some power in there, some comfort, and are really so yeah, I was wondering if it might be a you know, a sociological observation.
I mean, I think there's something there. I mean, I'm kind of hyper attuned to kind of gender issues, apart from where I teach, but I mean, these issues really matter to me, but this one seems more class issues.
Yeah.
And I think that makes sense, right? I mean, these most likely, you know, these are Mula Sarvastivadin text written in the Gadara area during a time of kind of great urbanization and a kind of financial boom with kind of increased wealth, particularly from international trade. And maybe there's some sense of like, you know, with money, instead of people being generous, they're actually being stingy. But we can't place the text with any great exactitude. But these are the kinds of things that we can begin to tease out. And future scholars who do work on this will have more texts, and I'm sure we'll be able to make much more refined suggestions.
So I'm wondering if, so I'm going to open it up to questions soon, but I'm wondering if we might go through the images a little bit before we do that. And maybe the question is some of the things that get creatively, well, you can decide what you want to do. What do you want to tell us about the images? But one of the questions I have is how they are sort of not just a straight representation of what we find in the text, but kind of creatively elaborating on it, and sometimes with their own logic. So
I mean, what's interesting about the texts is the images are not kind of, we might say, direct and perfect representations of what we find in the text. That generally doesn't happen. But in some ways, the images are trying to do work, right? In the same way that the texts are trying to do work on their readers or on their viewers, and trying to engender a certain kind of emotional response. In the text, it's very clear that what they're, I mean, and then they're explicit. They want to invoke some vega, right? A kind of, whether we call it kind of like aesthetic shock or being kind of deeply moved, and that we're supposed to see something that's disgusting, or in this case, read something and imagine something and be moved in this way. And as kind of Hungry Ghost, kind of ideas about Hungry Ghost move from culture to culture, place to place, time to time, the ideas about Hungry Ghost transform, right? And these are kind of represented in different ways. So by looking at all these different images, it was sort of like a way of trying to make sense of different cultural and social moments, a kind of social imaginary, and how Hungry Ghosts might fit in them. And that so many of the images were really cool. But if you want me to share some, I'd be happy to do a quick
that would
little,
be great.
Quick guided tour.
Yeah.
Okay. One second.
Yeah, and if people want to start collecting, we'll just call on people to can raise their hand to ask their questions. But if you want to type it out in the chat, feel free.
Can you see that first slide?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's just I'm going to go through kind of some quick images just to give you a sense, but also kind of the range of the images. So this is one of the first images that we have from the Kizo complex in Zhejiang. This is 5th century CE. And what's interesting is this is actually an image from the Kotikarna Avadana, which I translated in the first volume of the Divya Avadana. And here it's Shroni Kotikarna, the kind of merchant who comes across these various hungry ghost cities. This is meant to be an iron city filled with hungry ghosts. And what's interesting is you see the images, we don't get the tiny mouths like kind of pinpricks and stomach like mountains. What we do is just see a group of people who are really hungry looking, right? Kind of like thin and emaciated. So I'm just going to kind of go quickly. This is from the Bezeklik caves, also in China later. It's from a really complicated cave. And I loved writing all the descriptions about these for the book and working with so many incredibly generous scholars who helped me make sense of things that were far beyond my range. But what I like about this is now suddenly we have fire. In that other image, right, we didn't see any flame imagery. Here we have images, but the hungry ghosts aren't actually inflamed as we find them on the text. It seems that they're kind of breathing flames, right? I mean, the flames are around them. And this is where we begin to see also kind of one of the figures that we'll find later in Hungry Ghosts is this almost like clown-like hair, where they're kind of bald in the middle and the hair is sticking out kind of on both sides. And once again, kind of very thin figures.
Yeah, Andy, that just brought up one question I had, which is a lot of times in the text you translated, they're covered with hair. And yeah. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about what that was about.
Almost nobody pictures them covered with hair, which is interesting. Like you look at all the images, almost never do you get them with hair. Although I'm going to show one where they're covered with like needle-like hair. So, but basically it's the pain. So one of the things that's clear about the kind of hungry ghosts in the text and other materials is that the body itself, being reborn in the body itself is a punishment, right? That being in the body is like a kind of torture, and that it's simply painful every moment to be in that body. So different communities might imagine that pain in different ways, or also want to aestheticize the pain. So this is the Path of Hungry Ghosts. This is a series of images that were used ritually, where there were kind of for various realms of existence in other states, there'd be kind of 10 of each. So here we get, instead of a singular hungry ghost, we get 10. I didn't mention it. There are cases that we have, even in this text, of hungry ghosts and then Preta Mahardika. These would be kind of hungry ghosts with great power. And we do have other texts also that mention different kind of hierarchies of hungry ghosts. But here within this kind of hierarchy of 10, we get kind of basically 3 groups of 3. In these kind of top 3, and we can see them with these kind of giant protruding stomachs, and again, very thin where you can kind of see the spine. The first hungry ghost in the top basically breathes fire. And this second hungry ghost is actually meant to have like kind of terrible breath. Each one of them kind of have like a very specific kind of malady or something that would cause them kind of discomfort or pain. And this is most clear actually in the second set of 3, the one on the far left. That's the kind of needle fur hungry ghost. It's basically the feeling of being kind of stuck with pins all through it. And again, this second hungry ghost, slightly higher class. And this is actually class, I think, more than kind of anything else. Again, that terrible breath. And the third, carrying around a giant goiter, which is also something that we'll find in the Tibetan tradition. And then the next 3, actually, you can see dressed much more like royalty. And sometimes these are thought of as either kings among hungry ghosts or even gods among hungry ghosts. And you can see they're adorned with various kinds of finery. And the 10th figure here is actually thought to be an Indian sage, a rishi. And that's why you see the matted hair. So I'm just going to go quick to kind of like give people just a range of them. These are certainly the most famous hungry ghost images, I think, in the world, the gakizoshi. These are from Japan in the 13th century. You can find them now in the Kyoto Museum or the Tokyo Museum, and these are thought of as national treasures. Here, hungry ghosts have moved into the city, right? So that we know that they're kind of coterminous with us, but here they're literally in the streets with us, and where others are defecating, hungry ghosts are eating, right? I mean, they're literally all around us. We get this other image again, these kind of like urban thoroughfares kind of surrounded by hungry ghosts. And, here they are kind of like tiny necks, small mouths, giant stomachs, kind of like licking up excrement. We'll also see here, you can see that kind of like discolored hair. And this Lafleur's kind of like great article on a hungry ghost kind of points out that at least in this case, and I'll make the argument kind of elsewhere as well, that hungry ghosts actually look a lot like starving people. That one of the things that happens when one is in a condition of starving, it's called kwashiorkor syndrome. One will get basically a bloated stomach, tiny necks, gangly limbs, loss of hair, discoloration of hair, that so many of these figures seem to have been modeled on people who are actually starving, which pushes that homology even further between hungry ghost and, we could say, the kind of the homeless starving in our communities. And here's another image of hungry ghosts in cesspools. And this image of hungry ghosts in a kind of charnel ground. You can see this hungry ghost with the skull and bone kind of in his hand. And again, we see that kind of like discoloration of hair, a dog, right? This kind of, these folks who are living kind of really kind of on the outskirts of town in a fairly desperate situation. And this kind of fantastic image of a hungry ghost approaching a monastic. I said I'm kind of moving quickly. This is a great image. I really love this image. This is the Burning Mouth Ghost King. It's housed right now in the museum in Kyoto. Sorry, it's from a temple in Kyoto, now housed in the Osaka City Museum of Fine Arts. I had to work with both organizations to allow me to get the image, and various people kind of helped me. Again, this was a kind of a great effort to even just get access to these images. And what I like so much about this image is this actually is an image that in part tells the story of feeding the hungry ghosts. So kind of as the story goes, as we find in texts, that this Burning Mouth Ghost King approaches Ananda, the Buddha's kind of assistant, attendant, and says to him, if you don't feed millions of hungry ghosts in the next 3 days, you're going to die and be reborn as a hungry ghost, which prompts Ananda to go to the Buddha and say, how can I possibly feed millions of hungry ghosts in the next few days? And so the Buddha teaches him a ritual for feeding hungry ghosts. And this in some ways is an image of the ritual. And this image itself would have been featured at one of these rituals. So now I'm going to just quickly take you through the ritual. We can see on the far left, there's Ananda with the 5-pointed hat of the officiant. He's got a kind of vajra and other ritual implements in his hand with 2 attendants side to side. Here's kind of the ritual officiant's kind of table. We can see, kind of candles and whatnot, but most important actually here is the text on the side. And next to him here is one of the hungry ghosts who's actually being like an assistant, carrying one of the pecho, one of the kind of the texts, the leaves. And we can see here's another hungry ghost down here who also has kind of carrying the manuscripts on his back. It's interesting, there's no text written on this manuscript, probably because the people who drew this didn't know how to make something look like Sanskrit. Also, you can see the manuscript pages look really heavy, which is not what they actually look like. Next to Ananda is the food offering table. And we see there are basically 3 stupas of food offering. On the far left are vegetables. In the middle are steamed buns. And on the right is rice. The hungry ghosts really like the steamed buns. And if we see here, you can see the hungry ghosts kind of streaming down on the right, then streaming to the bottom and loading themselves up with buns. You can see they kind of like are stockpiling them. And even here, there's one hungry ghost who ate so much that he's like pushing on another like very full hungry ghost stomach. It's like this joyous moment. And then you can see them kind of trooping back to wherever it is that they troop to. But the idea here is that kind of everyone gets fulfilled in this ritual, including Burning Mouth Ghost King. You can see that he has one of the steamed buns in his hand, right? He's kind of been rewarded. And you can see that this hungry ghost looks a lot like, we could say, the more higher class or the better to do hungry ghosts that we saw from the last image that we looked at. And here too, he's bedecked with various kinds of clothing and jewelry. And most importantly, you'll notice he also has a halo, right? I mean, this is not an ordinary hungry ghost. And that's when we look to the top and we see there's Guanyin, right? Guanyin in a kind of like, in her bank of clouds, kind of masterminding this operation to, as the texts say, get the Burning Mouth Ghost King to ask the Buddha to create this ritual so that all these hungry ghosts can be fed. And this is in many ways the way that people engage with hungry ghosts now is a way of feeding and is of caretaking. So not disgust, as we find in this text, but actually kind of compassion. This, of course, being a wheel of existence, samsara chakra, bhava chakra, which many of us, I'm sure, here recognize, which have the various kind of realms of existence held up by Yama. This is, I think, a particularly nice image. And here, if we zoom in on the realm of hungry ghosts, we can see kind of very stylized features. There's a kind of kinetic to the kind of, they're all in motion, and there are kind of flames interspersed. They're not so much kind of inflamed as being kind of encompassed in flames. In the middle of this, we'll see kind of two kind of features. We'll see Yama on the left, recognizable because he has a staff made of a spinal column. So kind of the Yama, so here in some ways, the hungry ghost being associated again with Yama when he lives 500 yojanas kind of under the ground. And on the right, probably Hariti with kind of two children beside her. And here, a slightly different reworking of the Hariti story, but probably a kind of curse, imagining her, what could be worse than being reborn as a hungry ghost would be one where you actually have children that you can't feed. So unclear. And above in this realm, we could say our visitors. There's the Buddha, Vajrapani, and Manjushri kind of up there, and Tara off to the right. And what I think what's interesting here is that you see the hungry ghosts beneath Tara who are not inflamed, which gives you some sense that this might have been part of who can intercede in my condition, who can help me feel better. And here we imagine the Buddha and particularly Tara. And I'm going really fast just so everybody gets just a little flavor of like a hungry ghost tour around the world. So went from, China and Japan, Tibet, and now we're in Thailand. And this is from one of the great stories of Pramalai. So Pramalai, and this is from a kind of recitation version of the Pramalai text, where he goes kind of journeying through kind of out the various kind of realms of existence and the human world and kind of does good deeds. These are kind of heroic stories, and there are Pramalai narratives kind of all over Thailand. Here's the very first page of this manuscript. We can see hungry ghost realm on the left and the hell realm on the right. And let's just zoom in on that hungry ghost realm. And here, what's nice is you can actually read the Pramalai text along with the images and understand something about what's going on. So here, the image, this person on the far left, what he's carrying over his shoulder, what they say is that he has enormous testicles, right? He's kind of cursed with this enormous testicles that he wears like a shoulder bag kind of over his shoulder. And it said that this happens to, when this happens to government officials who cheat the people. So I thought that was a kind of interesting kind of curse. But here we can see very different imagination of hungry ghosts. This person on the left here with no face, and this person here with a face actually in her crotch, or his, it seems like kind of women, with again being inflamed in various places. This figure actually with a kind of face and body with a water buffalo, and these are described in the texts. So we get a kind of a whole different set of torments and a different way of imagining the kind of the bodies of hungry ghosts. And here they're all in positions of veneration as Pramalai has kind of peeked through the clouds to look into their realm. So I'm just like speeding along. Now we're in the 20th century. And this is an image I kind of want to connect to the hungry ghost stories. These are known as Karni Barni images. They entered into kind of Indian chromolithography in the late 19th century, kind of early 20th century. These are from the Ravi Verma Press, kind of very famous. He was kind of a very famous artist who then started his own chromolithography press. And this genre of images are the kind of you reap what you sow. And they're paired images from deeds, and we could say custom devised torments in hell realms, which is also something that we get often in the Preta realm, where we get kind of customized torments for kind of beings, not just generic torments that we might read about in the hell realm, but specific torments as people kind of have to work through their karma. So here we'll see what happens when you put a rope through like an oxen's nose, or you're a fishmonger, or you kind of like cheat on your taxes, or you drink alcohol, or you're an adulterer, or you kill animals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get this idea of kind of reaping what you sow. These come particularly through Jain materials, but the Jains and the Buddhists shared similar sensibilities about kind of like karmic stories and karmic images. And then lastly, we want to make sure we have time for questions. This is the most recent one. I found this, it's a kind of a contemporary artist now living in Japan who creates all these kind of images of kind of folklore, gods, deities, and others. And I reached out to him because I was kind of fascinated by it, because he actually created an image that's the most like the hungry ghosts in the story. And he's doing it actually from reading stories. So here we get a group of hungry ghosts who are in that liminal place on the outskirts of town, no one around. We can see them again, like with tiny dangling necks, giant stomachs, spines kind of visible in various positions of like consuming excrement. We have one over here kind of licking up excrement, another one here with kind of like excrement kind of in like eating it middle. You can see kind of his mouth full, and another one either about to eat or about to kind of cough it up. It's kind of unclear. And one hungry ghost there in the middle, just looking dejected. That's my quick hungry ghost tour.
Yeah, thank you.
What I wanted to do is just to give people a range, which is that hungry ghosts in some ways are responding to people's needs. And in their images, people are creating something that works for particular communities, not trying to literally follow text necessarily, but that hungry ghosts become a kind of workshop, both in text and in image, for people to think about anxieties with ancestors, think about anxieties with meanness, and also struggle with ideas of disgust.
Great, thank you. That was really wonderful. And I'm glad we actually talked about the text first, because I think we could have spent the whole time asking you questions about those images too. But I'm glad we got to see them. So there are some questions already in the chat, and I want to, people, if you want to raise your hands and ask questions, but I'll relate some that came in to the chat. So there were some questions about just getting clear on the literature. And so where did the stories first appear? And then somebody also mentioned the Pali collection that you mentioned. So if you could give us just your little thumbnail of the literature again.
So I'll just give you a few highlights of it. There isn't a single notion of what hungry ghosts are, what preta are throughout the material. It's clear that people are responding to Brahmanical materials, right? And in some ways, instead of a 2-week period of being kind of a ghost to then move on to the ancestral realm, this becomes a kind of more permanent realm that people can inhabit. But within that, when you look at the Petavatu, what's really interesting is that people can become hungry ghosts not just from the human realm, but from any realm. And they also, in some ways, can become hungry ghosts for a variety of different reasons. What's a pleasure about that text is it's not systematized. However, the commentator on it, when we read the commentary on the Petavatu, does a very good job of systematizing a text that is actually not systematized. So what's nice is actually you can see a little bit of a struggle between a text that hasn't been fully systematized and the work that commentators do to make it systematic. So that's one thing. So the Petavatu is interesting in some ways because you get a range of different views. We don't actually get, the imagery comes to the Pali tradition much later. We don't get any textual references to hungry ghosts having tiny mouths and stomach like mountains until after the 13th century. So it's a relatively kind of late addition to the Pali kind of visual imaginary. But again, now we have to disassociate between hungry ghosts in a kind of textual imaginary and hungry ghosts in a visual imaginary, and know that the two didn't fully travel together. So when we're playing the kind of the dating game, which is what scholars kind of love to do, and I like it too, there's the textual dating game and the visual dating game, and they don't match up. Like they're two different sets of histories, so it's complicated. We certainly know that hungry ghosts get mentioned in passing from very early on, right? I mean, it's not that this realm of existence didn't exist in that imaginary. It just wasn't really a kind of something to be focused on. That's what I find that's so interesting about this text. This is the earliest text we have that's really kind of focusing on them kind of exclusively with a kind of cohesive vision of kind of what they are.
And what's the time period again for your text?
We'll call it 3rd, 4th, 5th century. I mean, it's always fuzzy dating, but we can say that it's fluid, and others I'm sure will now do more work, it's certainly my hope, and can kind of pinpoint these various kind of, by using certain key terms and descriptions, key images that show up, they'll be able to kind of do more work. But one of the conundrums that scholars get to ask is, why are there almost no images of hungry ghosts and hell beings in early India? Monica Zinn has written about this and others, but no one has a really good answer. There's just an absence, but no one knows exactly why there's an absence, and wonders even if there could be a prohibition.
There is one question of clarification in the chat, and that is that you said that, you know, compared to hell realms, only one thing can get you born as 100. And so the gist was a question about clarification as to that. So
within, I mean, this is kind of, I mean, obviously, as I just said, even the Pitavatu, there are other cases where there are kind of multiple things that would get us born as kind of hungry ghosts. But for the most part, across the literature, there's this focus on mātsarya or mātsarya. Within the rest of the Buddhist world, of course, there's a whole variety of hot and cold hell realms, right? I mean, you get your 10 hot realms, you get your 10 cold realms, and there's a whole variety of deeds. You know, not everybody's going to be reborn in the Avicii hell. Like, you have to do something very particular to be reborn there. So then the question is, you know, why have they focused on this one singular phenomenon that leads people to be reborn in this condition? I don't know, other than they seem to have thought it to be very important.
Yeah. So let me
just pause for 1 second while you're asking
sure.
a question. Hold on 1 second.
Oh, sure. So I'm thinking that you're still listening to me. Just so one of the other questions was about if all ghosts are hungry ghosts. And then this question about, I read that what seems like water to us is pus for them. And then I want to go to the people who have their hand raised after that, even though there's more in the chat, but I want to get people with their hand raised to be able to. So
no, not all ghosts are hungry ghosts. There are other kinds of being that seem like ghosts, but again, it depends tradition by tradition. Certainly in modern times throughout much of South Asia, you know, Bhut, Pret, Pisach, people can be possessed by all kinds of beings. There's great stuff on possession and looking on kind of like different kinds of beings. So there are multiples. Here, though, this is the only, we might say, kind of ghost that kind of gets its own kind of realm of existence. And certainly within the Buddhist realm, the kind of ghost that's the most important. So that's the quick version. The other idea that kind of, you know, water or something would transform, we'll find that throughout the material. The idea is that hungry ghosts are perpetually hungry, and that because of their bad karma, whatever they pick up will turn into something noxious. So, you know, there are these stories of people trying to directly give food and drink to hungry ghosts, and it transforming into something terrible, because what hungry ghosts need isn't actually food or drink, it's they need merit. And one of the sad things about hungry ghosts is they basically are said that they don't really have the agency to produce their own good merit. They need interventions from others. They need other humans to perform acts of kindness on their behalf, whether the monastics or others will be intermediaries, so they can get merit, because that's what will allow them to more speedily kind of leave that realm.
I wonder if that's a holdover from the ancestors. But anyways,
good question.
Let's get so somebody with the initials TSB is first, and then AM, and then Lisa, and then Tiluk. That's the order.
Okay, TSP is me. Hi, I'm Thomas. Thanks, Professor Rotman. I really enjoyed your talk. And just really quickly, I believed in the hungry ghost growing up. I grew up in a Buddhist family, and so I'd bring out incense rice. That was our tradition, was that they had very thin throats and they could still consume the rice from the incense. And I'm thinking that, I mean, my take on why they always do something really bad and scary and bad faith is when you go out to a liminal space and you're wherever you are and you're making an offering to these hungry ghosts, you can't see anybody and you're straining to hear in the trees if there's anybody there. That's what you're thinking about, is some sort of, explosive event. So, I wonder if it might just be as simple as that, as, if anybody's seen Mulholland Drive, there's that scene of them getting scared by the guy jumping out from the dumpster. But my question was, are there any examples of hungry ghosts who have particular merit, who, are sort of the legendary, like, in Dante's Inferno, purgatory is filled with like actual, Virgil and people like that. Like, is there any example? The Burning Mouth Ghost King, it seems very close, that this distinguished figure was like this close to being a hungry ghost. But are there any other examples like that of sort of meritorious figures who are maybe a little higher up?
Yeah, so, I mentioned this, particularly in kind of this kind of early genre of text, particularly associated with Melissa Vasavadhan's. There's this other class of being called kind of Preta Mahardika. And basically they're better off hungry ghosts. They're kind of hungry ghosts with more power. So there is some sense that you can kind of move up within the hungry ghost realm. And certainly within other texts, and I talk about this in the book, they'll have a kind of hierarchy of hungry ghosts. And we saw that as well in the images. So there is some way of kind of moving up, but in some ways, all of them are still cursed, right? I mean, it's still like, the going is never that good in the hungry ghost realm. What you really want to do is kind of move beyond the hungry ghost realm. But what I find interesting is that all the hungry ghosts, regardless of that status, seem to be truth tellers. And, that it's not just that they want to tell their story, they want their story to be told. So, they serve that special purpose of being able to kind of tell others the dangers of meanness. So anyway, but I love that you're kind of, I encourage folks to engage with the material, make it useful and interesting for yourselves. I mean, that's part of what the stories are meant to do, not just a dry history lesson or what people might have thought a few millennia ago, but maybe something that could be interesting and helpful for us.
Great.
Thanks, that's wonderful.
AM.
I think that's me. Is that me? Okay, AM for Ann Mako. So, hi, Andy. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's fantastic. I was really surprised during the explanation of the slide with the Hungry Ghost King, because I looked at the platter in the middle of the offering table and I was like, oh, it's pindas. As somebody who works more in Hinduism, it looked obviously to me like Hindu death rituals. And of course the Pretas want pindas because that's what they make bodies out of. And then it was instead. So I was wondering if this is something that, like the huge game of telephone across Asia, that things sort of travel but not quite. Is it just a known thing that hungry ghosts like round white things for some reason, and in the absence of Brahmanical rituals you have to find a different familiar round white food? Am I making that up?
It's a great question, and I never thought about it, but just kind of to explain to others, in Brahmanical ritual, the idea is that you would be kind of in this liminal state that would be a kind of preta, this kind of being, and that by people performing pindadan, offering pinda, literally kind of like balls of food, it kind of embodies, it allows people to kind of take on bodies so that they can move to the kind of the ancestral realm. And pindas actually look a lot like those dumplings that the hungry ghosts are consuming in that image with the Burning Mouth Ghost King. So is there a connection? I don't know, but I like to think about it. And I don't know much about the kind of the history of steamed dumplings in China, but I'm definitely going to ask. And when I find out, I'll get back to you.
Excellent. Thank you.
So Lisa is up now.
Hi, yeah, I apologize for looking like a ghost myself tonight, but I don't have good lighting here and it's already dark where I am. Yeah, so thank you so much for the talk, Dr. Rotman, or Andy, if I may. I had your book, can't see it very well, but yes, I'm reading it. I'm actually, I work in Japanese Buddhism, and my current research is on the Sakaki ghost feeding ritual based on Chinese rituals. And what I've been mostly looking at are, as far as the canonical sources for the hungry ghosts, is the Shobo Nenjo Kyo, or the Zhengfan Chujing. I guess I'm not good at pronouncing Sanskrit, but the Sadharma Smriti Upasthana Sutta.
Yes.
Which lists 36 types of hungry ghosts, which eat vomit, feces, newborn children, all kinds of things, and it describes the needle-nosed ones. And what I'm really fascinated about is whether the Sadharma Smriti Upasthana Sutra got these descriptions of hungry ghosts from the stories that you have translated, or what is the textual lineage, or does anybody even know?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I, of course, read through the text, read through all the descriptions, and I'm like, where did they get these 36? And then I know that it occurs as well in kind of East Asian sources. I don't know the lineage. It doesn't come from this material. Someone else will kind of, that's the kind of work that Buddhist scholars love to do, right? Yeah. These questions of textual lineage. I don't know where it comes from. It absolutely doesn't come from here. What's interesting in these stories is we have multiple lineages. So we have one version, there's just hungry ghosts. We have another version where there's hungry ghosts, and there are those Preta Mahardika, the powerful hungry ghosts. And then in other traditions, both in the Sanskrit and Pali tradition, we have folks who basically did good deeds and bad deeds. So half of every day, they're like hungry ghosts. And the other half of the day, they're like lounging with like divine maidens. So it's clear that there are different kind of classes and conditions of being hungry ghosts, and they seem particular kind of to different texts. I have not figured out all the lineages. That was one where it was like, oh, but it's, well, maybe that'll be your work.
Thank you.
And Tillich has a question.
Hi, Dr. Rotman. Thank you so much for the talk. I found it very captivating. So my initial question was sparked when you said that we should, or the right way to engage with hungry ghosts is through compassion, not feeling disgust, something like that. So then my question was, what form does that compassion take? And you kind of just touched on it like 5 minutes ago, and you said they don't really need food, they need meritorious actions done on their behalf. Yeah. So then my question was, so why are there depictions of, like 1,000 hungry ghosts being fed? And is that actually showing them any compassion? Does that help them at all? Or
it's a great set of questions. So let me take it as two parts. Okay. One is the disgust part. And what the texts are really saying is that the disgusting things are mental states, not bodies, right? The disgusting thing are kind of like humans, the humans who are taken over by meanness. That's disgusting. People who happen to be reborn in one body or another and suffer those, that's not disgusting. That's like a kind of penalty. So like, if there is something disgusting, it is really the mental state of kind of meanness. So within this, it's the question of, so how do you treat hungry ghosts? That's the one question. But then how do you actually treat kind of humans in your community? And I want to bring something out which I hadn't said before. So one part is, so within the logic of this, we can't feed hungry ghosts directly. The idea is that hungry ghosts is that we perform meritorious deeds, generally by offering to kind of like monks or nuns to the Sangha, and they can direct the merit to hungry ghosts, fine. But we also have this idea that kind of hungry ghosts are in our midst. And, I hinted at it when I said that, oh, these, hungry ghosts, they look like starving people, right? I mean, in their images. And, there's that way of, well, what do you do for the starving people in your community? And you feed them. So this is and in that case, when you're feeding them, are you imagining them as hungry ghosts, or have you somehow used the logic of hungry ghosts as a way to not belittle folks because of their external forms, right? To actually focus on the internal. Like, what is it that will allow you to develop kind of compassion for those who are kind of poor and suffering in your community? And we'll find, in many hungry ghost feeding rituals kind of around the world, like humans in a community get fed, the poor, the hungry, the suffering. And there's been kind of reworking of hungry ghost rituals too, that are directly simply kind of like feeding of the homeless and dispossessed in your community. There's just one other interesting note, which I didn't say, that I wanted to add in, is that when we read the descriptions of kind of hungry ghosts in the texts, we have this kind of group of people who are basically socially invisible, right? Anybody can see them with their human eye, but we've been trained not to see them. They live on the margins of society. They're poor, they're starving, and they're surrounded by urine and excrement. I mean, it sounds kind of incredibly like the position of manual scavengers. This is the kind of the lowest of the low within kind of South Asia. And traditionally their occupation has been to kind of remove night soil. Basically, they're removing other people's kind of urine and excrement, and they live in absolutely the poorest places just outside of town, where they then have to dump that urine and excrement. There's that part of it, which is like, well, these hungry ghosts sound not mysterious at all, but just absolutely the poorest and most desperate people in a community. So when you're feeding hungry ghosts, is that really just a way of talking about feeding the most poor and deprived in your community? So that would require either reading the text kind of metaphorically or thinking in that way. But when you read the descriptions and keep the idea of manual scavengers in mind, it's really hard not to see them. But I like the idea, I'll say to you too, like that, I think of these as good text to think with, that the goal isn't necessarily to fully decode it, it's to productively engage it in a way that works for you. I mean, that's my own kind of ethical sensibility. And, to read the text in a way that kind of inspires interesting thoughts and ideas.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if you had another question, Lisa, or if your hand was just up from before. Okay.
I apologize. It's left
okay.
up from
the
That's
ghost
okay.
hand.
I had one just follow up. There's one of the stories in the text, Andy, where the person who's going to become the hungry ghost, I think it's a woman who's like looking down on the monks, doesn't want to give, or a monk doesn't want to give them food, and is saying, oh, they're like hungry ghosts. And so there's this kind of double, like some kind of doubling going on there. I couldn't quite formulate it in my head how to put that question.
It's a kind of projection, right? I mean, part of what they're saying is that when one is infected by mātsarya, taken over by meanness, you see the rest of the world as people who are these kind of avaricious, kind of clingy beings, not recognized when people are not. And if we think about it as, having mātsarya is like wearing glasses where you project out and you look at the world, and basically what you see is you think that everyone is a petty asshole.
Right, but you are. I mean, not you.
Yes, yes, that's the, yes.
Yeah, there was one question in the chat. I keep losing it here. Sanjoy had asked, yeah, everyone can see a hungry ghost. And he said, regarding your question, I wonder, how do we relate to the scriptural hungry ghosts with modern day capital society or capitalism? Like, what are some thoughts, I guess, about seeing hungry ghosts?
I'll tell you.
You started to answer that a little bit, yeah.
I remember when it wasn't that long ago, and it was just before I was teaching this with some students. And at that time, there'd been this kind of during COVID moment, and they'd turned basically a hotel into a place for the homeless in the Upper West Side and in New York City. And then there'd been a kind of revolt by people in the community because they're like, well, we don't want those people living among us. And I was like, oh yeah, maybe they would have some benefit from engaging with a text like this and thinking, what is it that they find so disgusting? What is it that they find so alienating? And, in some ways, are they deluded, right? I mean, what is it that makes us think that that's disgusting? But yet somehow, is it disgusting to change a baby's diaper? There are other situations where you're like, oh, that's not. Like, what is it that has conditioned that form of disgust? And that's part of what the texts are talking about too. We're socially trained either not to see these folks or simply to find them disgusting, focusing on external forms, not on the internal. And what matters most? Terrible thoughts, terrible deeds, terrible bodies? Really? So I think that one could productively engage the text along that line.
Mm-hmm. So there's a question from Chihiro, and then Thomas, I see you have a question. I'll just go to Chihiro first.
Yes, thank you very much for your great talk. And my question is related to the hanging scroll of the Hungry Ghost ritual preserved at the Osaka Museum of Arts. Mm-hmm. And in that hanging scroll, there was a big hungry ghost depicted at the center, and below the hungry ghost, the ritual was going on. And then at the top, I remember that an image of Kannon is depicted. Mm-hmm. And then my question is related to the Kannon image. And I've never thought about the saber from the Hungry Ghost realm. And if you know, I would like to know at what point in history Kuan Yin came to be associated with the Hungry Ghost realm. And I also wonder, is it a tradition specific to East Asia, or that association of Kannon with Hungry Ghost realm can be observed at other part of Buddhist Asia?
As best I know, it's an East Asian phenomenon, and that the association comes late. That it's a kind of that the ritual and the language around the ritual evolved over time, and that first it started as that it was initiated by Burning Mouth Ghost King, and then later that Guan Yin was brought in, and it was said that, oh, Guan Yin masterminded the event and had the Burning Mouth Ghost King address Ananda. I don't know the particular dates. So much of that I was kind of reading with others and dependent on other scholars. Some of it is kind of buried in my own footnotes, but I'm not an expert enough to say anything more intelligent than I've already said. I would trust you much more than I would trust me.
Thank you very much. My area of study is Japan, but I have never seen the relationship between Kuan Yin and the Hungry Ghost realm or the Hungry Ghost ritual. And I wonder if it's more popular in China. And so if you know.
I'm really not sure about that. There's one scholar who did his dissertation. There's a number of, Dan Stevenson, there are a number of good scholars who've done good work on all of that. And it's really kind of mining their work or kind of contacting them. But no, it's just, that's beyond my knowledge. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and your talk really inspired me. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
While we're pulling Thomas up, I have one question is, have you been to the Hungry Ghost theme park in Thailand? Some Upali Shraman put that in the chat. Yes.
And what's really nice is Benedict Anderson kind of wrote this book about kind of these Hell Realm theme parks in Thailand. It's very cool. Thanks.
I've seen the Hell one. I didn't know there was a Hungry Ghost one. All right. So Thomas, you're up.
Yeah, I had a quick follow-up just because of somebody brought up the capitalism connection, and there's this great documentary I wanted to recommend. It's called Harvest of Shame. It's from 1960. back when they could make these sorts of documentaries in America. Edward R. Murrow made this documentary about itinerant farmers in America who travel from Florida around the country and are subsistence farmers. So they have barely enough food to survive, basically, and their kids are just looking to have enough food to keep their brains going for education. But the connection here is, you brought up the hungry ghosts always tell the truth. And one thing you notice watching this this exposition of the feeling of hunger, because you see, these hungry people, is it's very often that malnourished people are very much in this sort of state of almost like trance-like state of not necessarily seeing that anything's wrong with the world. And it's quite tragic to witness, actually, because, a lot of these people, their eyes are, glazed over. There's that famous photo as well by Dorothy, I'm forgetting the name, so I won't bring it up. But, it's important to remember that hunger, there's homelessness and destitution and degradation everywhere, but this phenomenon of hunger is a specific one that is hidden, from common sight. And it's absolutely, I'm sure, what they were focusing on with this is the cost of food compared to what the worker, the lowest person in society, has to accomplish to put that food on the table for the average family is completely out of whack. So anyway, I wonder if that could be the reason, is that malnourishment does cause this sort of trance, like almost not happy-go-lucky at all, but that sort of a clear twilight removal from reality.
I mean,
that's
these folks in the story they're literally on fire. So maybe in such a horrific condition, you're burning with honesty. I'm not sure, but great question. Thank you for getting me to think about that. And also the Dorothy Lang photos.
There was another question in the chat, which was about, are there ways of helping the hungry ghosts in stories beyond feeding? That was the question from Dan.
Yes.
I mean, you said merit, but I'm not.
But part of that is, and this is a question, that's probably the most pressing for folks is, for folks who are in the here and now, being kind of overcome with mātsarya, right? This kind of meanness arises. When the text says this, meanness arises, and what we have to do is kind of not cling on to it. When it arises, we just want to let it arise and fall away. And, what are the things that we can do, like when it affects us, like me, as an individual? And, one of the things that the text says, of course, is giving. Like, if you're clinging to something, give it up. And not give it up necessarily because someone else needs it, but give it up because you're clinging to it and it's making you deluded. So again, thinking of the benefits of charity. And what's interesting in this is that the charity is really small scale charity, right? And these are really tiny things. A monk comes up to a well, there's a young woman, she's like getting water out of the well, and the monk says like, oh, can I have a glass of water? And she's like, I wouldn't give you a glass of water. Then my pot wouldn't be full, right? Like there's just this like mean vindictiveness. Doesn't really cost her anything, but there's a kind of a pleasure in the cruelty. And what we want to do is kind of eradicate meanness and eradicate that kind of pleasure in the cruelty. And that's an individual process. And we can think about it as others, but the texts really want us to kind of look inside. How do we do that with ourselves? And all of us are kind of infected in one way or another with this. I'm sure we've all felt that when someone else has benefited and someone else has moved up in some way. And there's that sense of like a little spitefulness. How do we eradicate that from ourselves? And the text gives some suggestions, certainly kind of donation, but part of it is do the work to actually be introspective and to notice these things and to not confuse righteousness and self-righteousness. Mm-hmm. They're not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. That's a good place to end it. Maybe there was one last little question coming up in the chat. It's hard to leave, but it was, can hungry ghosts learn generosity? So this is going, you were going in a different, like what we can learn, basically, we can prevent becoming hungry ghosts by tending to the hungry ghost amongst us,
Right.
maybe is one way to put that. But this is, can the hungry ghosts themselves learn well, I guess ourselves as hungry ghosts, can we learn?
Yeah, I mean, but I think that's the thing is what the text is really doing in many ways, probably the biggest lesson that I learned from hungry ghosts is I'm so used to thinking about hungry ghosts as, beings who are reborn in that realm of existence. And the text really focusing on humans who develop hungry ghost mindsets. And those humans are us. They're not others. They're me. And what can I do when that deluded mind state arises in me? And there I am justifying it and rationalizing it, but at some deep level, probably in bad faith, recognizing that isn't really righteousness, it's self-righteousness. How do I eradicate that? What do I do for me? What do I do for others? That's a great question. The text gives little hints of answers here, recognizing the kind of the power of charity and the power of kind of giving up and giving away. But I think it also kind of passes on the work to us. Or we could imagine monastic teachers or others to think, well, what do we do? What do we do when we find that kind of clinging feeling, when we find that self-deluded kind of spitefulness arising up in us? Not even others, just let's start with ourselves. What do we do? That's a hard set of questions. And I'll say for me, having read more of this material and thought about it, I see it in myself. And I feel like if there's work to be done, it should start at home with ourselves.
And maybe not just with the material, you also with other intangible benefits that others enjoy, and the sort of meanness we can feel in respect to just the joys of other people's lives. So thank you so much, Andy. This was really a fun conversation. And, I think looking at the chat, we could go on, but really appreciated. So big Zoom thank you for Andy. And we'll have this, it's been recorded so we can share. And I need to talk to you about what the images mean, but maybe we can catch up after for a moment about sharing it. Okay, great. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.